Yeah, this is the best time to be up here right after lunch. I know half of you guys don't care, the other half are pretty sleepy. So in that spirit, I'm going to make this a little bit more of an interactive kind of panel discussion. I'm not going to do 15 minutes at the end for questioning. I'm just going to say while we're discussing, because I've had a lot of great talks with these guys during the conference, and obviously had a lot of time to see what you guys were talking about in the last 2 days as well. So we're going to try to weave that together. When you hear something a point that we're talking, just feel free to throw your hand up, and we'll involve you in the discussion right away. So they're going to get a lot of exercise. They're going to be running around with microphones. Do feel free to jump in. And I do realize that our topic doesn't have any cool pop culture reference in the title, like Survey Wars. That was nice, Dan. So let's just call this Star Trek Next Generation Insights. How about that? I wove it in. So basically on that, what I want to do is start off by, I guess we're going to talk to George first, because as we saw during his presentation, which was quite wonderful, very academic and interesting, but it kind of leads into what are we discussing here in terms of the, what are we going to be looking at in the future? In 5 years, what are we going to be doing when we're talking at this event? But I guess before that, let's do something a little bit interactive with the audience, I suppose. Because you guys just ate, so if you could please stand up if you have ever used, not yet, no, wait, let me finish. Please stand up if you have used Google Glasses. All right, please stand up if you've used a smartwatch or a Fitbit or something like that. If you own one, if you use one. More people standing up, wonderful. Now, you know what happens next. Everyone stand up if you have a smartphone. Hey, we knew that was coming. Look at that. You guys need to stand up anyway. You just ate. So pretty much everybody's standing up. Now, sit down if you have done research utilizing Google Glasses. Oh, really? Awesome. Please sit down if you've used research that came from a device like a smartwatch or Fitbit, something like that. You wearable technology. Now please sit down if you've done research using a smartphone. Oh, you guys are liars. But all right, if you've done it well. Now everybody has to stand back up. But I mean, the whole purpose there is, you know, probably more people have smartphones than they've actually done research. And the idea that we want to have here is how do we bridge that gap? How do we make it so as soon as something comes out, we're actually utilizing it and we're giving insights to the clients and marketers. So with that in mind, let's do a little bit of a discussion around that. So George, am I going to have a job in 5 years, or are we at a stage where basically machines are going to learn to do what we do and we're not going to have to sit in a room and do research anymore?
Yeah. Thanks for that. So I get this question a lot, and that is that it's employment going to dry up when the fourth industrial revolution causes machines to replace jobs that are done by humans right now. So the answer is a yes and no. So there are, of course, many kind of repetitive jobs that are easily automatable. Those jobs are going to disappear, that's for sure. And so if you look at, for example, equity research, just looking up the financial results of a company and writing a benchmarking study, typically what research analysts, equity research analysts write, that is now completely automated by a company called Narrative Science. So these kinds of jobs are going to disappear. So I think the more accurate picture is it's not, a scenario where machines systematically eat up jobs and then, there's mass unemployment, but that jobs will split into two categories. So on the one hand, there are jobs that require manual labor that are very, very difficult to automate. Like, for example, waiting on tables at a restaurant. There will be a lot of these kinds of jobs, right? And then on the other hand, these are very low value jobs. On the other hand, there are very, very high value jobs like designers, data scientists, and and so on, politicians, So these jobs are not, they're very difficult to automate, and they require very, very high creative input. So the people that are in these jobs are going to be very highly valued, and they're going to be very, very well rewarded. So if you look at the field of, say, architecture that has gone through many technological revolutions, today nobody drafts an architectural diagram on pen and paper anymore. So every architect has to learn how to work with drafting, illustration software to draft architectural plans. Now there's a next stage of evolution in architecture right now called algorithmic architecture, where architects build buildings that mimic natural forms in nature, like birds' nests and and beavers' dam. So if you look at the Olympic Stadium in Beijing, it resembles a bird's nest, and it was designed by an algorithm with very, very little input from a human designer. It was not put line by line by a human architect. So the ability to master skills like this, to design buildings not by drafting every single line, but by writing a computer program that can put out an organic design inspired by nature and yet structurally correct. Now that is going to be a very, very valuable skill, and it will separate the people working in the architecture industry between the mass of colorless and poorly paid jobs and the star performers.
Great, thanks for that, George. I guess the output there is start working on your resumes. So, I mean, that definitely brings us to a point to where we're now looking at all of these different data points that are becoming available more and more so every day. And I guess we get into this question, I mean, we were talking about this before we got up on stage in terms of the panel. Where do we see, or how do we see us being able to kind of interweave all of those data points regardless of where they've been collected, whether it's offline or online through mobile? So I guess going to Eli a little bit, how do we see ourselves being able to kind of interweave that data, and how do we keep it relevant or keep ourselves relevant coming from the panel industry? Are we able to do that? And whether that has like explicit, implicit data points that we can discuss.
Yeah. So listening to George's presentation earlier, it was fascinating, eye-opening, and scary, to some of us. But I think what we miss in all these algorithms is the why. So we know the what. So can I ask someone on the left side of the room to please take a picture of the panel? Charlotte. So if we would take that data point, like someone's taking a picture during this panel, like what's interesting and why did someone do it, we don't know that they were told to do it. So the same would go to any sort of field. So like in the medical field, you can take all the things like people's symptoms, but you don't know their feelings. You don't know like that someone's heart is racing because they're feeling stressed about their job. And a human can know those questions to ask. So I would say like, if we go to an implicit only world, it's a scary world because we're not gonna know these whys. We're gonna be in a world where, my favorite story I like to tell about implicit data is, this was I think in 2011. So 5 years ago, Target in the US sent a mailer to a 13-year-old who was pregnant. And they had all these coupons to go and buy diapers. So the girl's father went to the manager of the store, and he was very upset about what they're doing and what sort of implications they're making about his daughter being pregnant. And the manager apologized, this being the US, he probably gave them a lot of money and a really long letter. And then 3 weeks later, he called again to make sure that everything was okay. And the father's like, I actually have to apologize to you, my daughter is pregnant. So that data exists, right? We can find these things, but do we know the story behind it? Do we know who that individual we're doing things with? So as we go to the mobile world, and IoT even more, and IoE even scarier, we know way too much stuff, but we don't have any of the color behind it. So I think like, if we start relying on that too much, we make mistakes. Like in this case, the girl was actually pregnant. What if she wasn't? What if she had some sort of ailment that was private? So I think we need us more than ever.
Well, okay, then you don't have to brush up your resumes yet. But no, I think I have actually heard that story before. I think I might have seen it before from you actually. And it was kind of like, how do we do this without being creepy? Basically, it's like, you can collect a lot of data, just don't be creepy about it. Don't use it for creepy things. So, I mean, when we're talking about how we actually utilize that data, and I mean, we've got Todd up here, so he's actually a user of the research and all these different data points. So I guess getting your perspective, I'll probably hand you a microphone. You're mic'd up, great.
Yeah.
Just how have you been seeing some of these new data points coming, and how have you been able to utilize them when it comes to making your decisions from a research perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that you have to be very careful about what you use and what you imply from it. So we're a online grocery service, and because we have customers shopping with us 2-3 times a month for years on end, we gather a lot of information about them. And we've tested out a whole variety of different algorithms for predicting or trying to predict new categories, new products that customers may be interested in. And our limited testing suggests that that's a very dangerous field to go into. I think from a marketing perspective, it makes intuitive sense. Try to guess what customers want and show them. But to Eli's point, you can guess wrong very easily. And so we've tried to pull back on that and really take an approach of letting customers tell us more, so asking more than guessing. So yeah, it is a very fine line you have to play when you start assuming that because you have data and because you have algorithms that the end result's going to be perfect.
Great. I mean, and definitely that's, when we're looking at it across different markets as well, I mean, so that's coming from kind of like a Singapore-based observation. Do we have anybody in the audience who's actually from, trying to utilize this maybe in Malaysia or other countries? Is there somebody out there who maybe can talk a little bit about their experiences in a different market rather than something that's like hyper-connected like Singapore? How have you been able to kind of overcome or utilize and distill that information from a lot of different points? Is there anybody that would like to, come on, I'm trying to get you guys involved. Anybody? Oh, okay, my mustached friend. Well, basically, I just want to see what we can get from other countries in terms of how have we taken all of these variety of data points and kind of successfully distilled that information and utilized it. So obviously in a country like Singapore or even Japan, where I'm coming from, the technology is there already. It's just kind of the application of it. But in developing markets, you might not have that reach yet. So I'm just looking for some experiences in other developing markets in terms of what we've seen and how has that been used. Thanks, by the way, Pravin.
Yeah, thank you. I can give an example of what we are working on, and it's been successful in a limited way because we focus on small data. Take big data, throw it out the window for now, but in a country like mine, when you have disparate data, but also offline, which is significant, online is also generating. So I love the earlier presentation where you have to match it. We do not yet have access to those kind of algorithms that do it automatically, so it's still manual labor, number crunching using whatever tools you have. But the focus is on the small data part of it, where we can look at it at a region, and by region I mean, for example, the Bukit Bintang area. Capture it and then slowly blow it up rather than taking the whole city or state en masse. So it's got to be focused on that. There is still a significant amount of manual labor involved, which cannot be thrown away as yet.
Great, thanks for that. I mean, so small data. And I mean, I guess that also kind of leads us into the discussion that we were talking about in terms of how do people keep themselves relevant? I mean, again, we need us more than we probably have before, but obviously our skill sets as researchers, people of users of research, we have to upskill that, and we have to make sure we're staying relevant. So how do we do that, or what are some of the ways that we can do that to make sure that we're constantly keeping ourselves and the people that we work with in the industry kind of relevant, and how do we keep ourselves upskilled, I guess, is kind of the discussion point I wanted to move into. So I don't, any of you guys, George or Eli?
So coming from SurveyMonkey, which is a tool that I think all of you guys have used, it's really advancing what we're doing towards where people are going. So whereas like when SurveyMonkey was created 17 years ago, it was just a web platform where people can go and create surveys. But we've had to advance that to now like where we have an SDK where people want to collect this kind of explicit data within an app because they're making these big data decisions, but they also want to color it a little bit. So now we have an SDK so they can just grab that without having to be like, could you wait a minute? We want to send you off to a survey on a different platform. Answer the survey, we'll capture that, we'll download it later, and then we'll go back to what we're doing. So like, we need to bring ourselves up to that so we're collecting data where people need to be. And the same would go with market researchers. If we're going to go and stay in Excel, we're not advancing. And we need to gather those skill sets where we're now being able to do things that are a lot harder or could actually be easier when we have more of this data in our hands. So like being able to do SQL lookups. So it's something like I kind of never want to do, but now I have to do that because this is the data we need. Like this data is here. Like people, all of you are, have smartphones in your pockets. So that there is something to be gleaned from that. Like, we saw that presentation from Alibaba. There's a lot from our Wi-Fi addresses. So the data's here, and to just say, well, it's too hard to get, we don't have that option. So we need to gather it and, as a market research skill, kind of put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, some of you have smartphones in your pockets. Some of you have them in your hands right now, which is not advisable, but okay. I mean, definitely keeping ourselves relevant as we upskill ourselves and move forward. And we're sitting here trying to talk about what are we going to see in the next 5 years in terms of how are we going to have access to data? What are we going to be sitting up here? It's mobile right now. What might be coming next? What do you think we're going to be seeing in terms of a data collection methodology in the next few years? George, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah. So before I take up Michael's question on the data collection, new data collection method, I want to revisit his question about how do people stay relevant? I mean, professionals like ourselves stay relevant in a future where things are increasingly automated. If you look at the information economy, there's actually a huge opportunity for people like you and I to do really well in the information economy. Today, consumer technologies are so pervasive and so easy to use. People spend a lot of their time getting hooked and their attention fragmented by social media, email, chat applications, and things like that. So the interesting paradox is that knowledge workers are really bad at knowledge work because of these tools, because our attentions are constantly being fragmented by most of us, are under pressure from emails and chat apps and all that. Our typical work life is spent in fragments of very shallow thought across all these activities. Now, what this means is that it's very, very difficult to hold our attention for extended period of time to master difficult concepts. And yet, to thrive in the information economy, we have to do exactly that, spend a lot of time deeply trying to master cognitively demanding concepts and tasks. So the key to making that transition is to actually put yourself in a situation where your attention is conserved and not fragmented, and that you devote yourself to mastering very, very complex and difficult concepts that is necessary to thrive in the new information economy. So I think this is a very, very key concept, that we could take advantage of, right? And so in Silicon Valley, there is now a very, very interesting trend of unplugging. That people working in tech take time to attend meditation retreats and to wean themselves off emails, to keep chat applications to interactions to the minimum. So that I think is important. The other thing is the ability to tell stories. There's a top-selling book in Japan right now called Strategy as Stories. And basically, I think the idea behind it is very, very sound, and that is that really what gives meaning, as Eli mentioned, the why to whatever that we do is this story. And the story gives us the meaning. And the machine cannot tell a story. Only humans can invent inspiring stories. I was once sent to a training that was run by the vice president of Honda R&D. He's a retired gentleman. And so he was with Honda since almost the founding days, and until his retirement. And he said Honda built a $150 billion company on one question. So Mr. Honda, when he founded the company, he started selling motorcycles and all that. It was all about answering one question. And that question is not, how do I maximize shareholder value? The question turns out to be, what is love? And so Mr. Honda believed that if everybody in Honda can answer this question, what is love, then Honda will be a very, very prosperous company. Right? So that's a very, very deep thought. And I think that this is exactly what we should be doing, and that's to tell stories that give our consumers meaning.
What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Todd, so I mean, going into that discussion there, I mean, kind of stepping back again into the keeping ourselves relevant. So I mean, at Redmart, how are some of the ways that you've been able to make sure that the team that you're working with is kind of keeping themselves relevant and making sure that they're meeting the demand of the consumers?
We go to conferences like these. And I say that in truth because, you know, I think that it's very easy when you're working for a company in an intense job, which I think we all have, that you just start getting blinders on and you just start having preconceived notion about the best way to conduct marketing, the best way to acquire customers, to conduct research. And going to conferences like these does give you that different exposure. And so, you know, I've learned a lot by listening to other speakers in tangential or even not so related fields, because everybody does take a different approach. And I think it's very easy these days when you need to specialize in so many things that you lose the forest for the trees.
Great. Yeah, I mean, we saw the goldfish kind of memory theme come up multiple times yesterday as well. And I guess that kind of feeds into it because we're all increasingly having a lot more things to pay attention to, but increasingly paying less attention to those things. And I mean, yesterday we had, keeping with the mobile theme, obviously that's giving us another way to be distracted. And when it comes to, so like from a data collection perspective, and you know, we saw the best friends forever, Jeff and James, yesterday having a lively discussion about mobile only, mobile 2, how do we do this? So I mean, keeping with that theme of mobile, Eli, how do we make sure that when that data is being collected that we're paying attention and kind of interweaving mobile into it, and are we using that first? Or is it just another tool that's coming into the toolkit?
So going back to your question of like what is the future, and that ties into what is mobile. And the truth is that like there are so many more things beyond mobile that kind of mobile is going to be obsolete. So if you think about like some of the things that people are now putting in their homes. So for example, in the US, Google has a company called Nest. So nobody would really buy Nest when it came out. It was kind of like a luxury product, but now the cost of Nest is very similar to getting a new thermostat. And we know what Google does, right? They're not an altruistic company. They're collecting this data, and now they're going to sell this to power companies, or more likely just build their own power company. But like there's a ton of data on like what temperature people want their homes when they're actually home, because you tell Nest when I'm coming home. You put a schedule. You tell Nest that you go away every weekend. So that's like one example of something coming up. So we don't just need to focus on mobile, we need to focus on all these other inputs. Another thing is Amazon has a device called Echo, which you put in your living room and it listens to everything happening. So again, mobile is, you're searching on mobile, it's usually on, but if you look at like your battery life and your screen time, your screen's probably on like 2-3 hours a day compared to like your thermostat 24/7 or a device sitting in your living room 24/7. So we need to gather all these inputs, and I think we're in a stage of data overload and need to figure out what matters. Like, do people's conversation in their living rooms matter? Not really, but if you figure out when to listen, they really matter. They matter way more than the search queries you put into your mobile device and the locations you go with your GPS.
Yeah, I mean, that raises the passive question as well. Are we looking at data overload from passive information? I mean, who here read about that, the Samsung TV that recently came out? Anybody read into that at all? Where basically there was a warning that was saying that, you know, try not to speak too much in front of the television because they're actually listening to what you're saying. Anybody read about that? Throw your hands up. One hand. Wow. Okay. But yeah, I mean, we're getting to that stage where there's a lot of information that's being pulled from us all the time. I mean, your Fitbit's like sleeping with you. It's telling you how you've slept. And we're going to be able to kind of get all of this data, but then what are we going to do with it? How are we going to utilize it? Because as Eli's saying, of course, it's very, if we know where to listen to, it's going to be very important. But how are we going to be able to get to that information? George, I mean, do you think there's a way that we're able to kind of distill the relevant bits?
Yeah, so building on Michael and Eli's point, the two sort of broad categories of data sources that will increasingly appear is instrumented environments. The physical environment itself contains instrumentation. And then also the wearables, which is devices that people wear on themselves, for various purposes, but it's indirectly collecting data. So these data are typically streaming data. They will stream in large volumes. And the best thinking around what to do with this right now, it's not to collect the raw data. There's just too much of it. And nobody knows what to do with it anyway. So in dealing with the streaming data, it's important that the best practice is to filter it, all right, and to collect accumulated patterns and store it for future purposes. So the first task is to have some kind of hypothesis around what this data is going to be good for in advancing consumer interests. And then to design a feature extraction method to extract permanent patterns from this data, semi-permanent patterns from this data, and then storing it for future use. Having said that, it's important that we do not forget the foundations of good science when we're doing all these things. The problem with big data is that the data that we work with is what we call found data. It is not data that is especially collected for research purposes. And because of this, the data has very varying levels of quality. In social science, we talk about validity and reliability of the measures. So wearables, for example, that measure blood pressure and heart rates, that are manufactured by different manufacturers, have varying levels of validity and reliability, and that's why doctors cannot construct healthcare programs around wearables unless they are very, very sure that the measurements that are taken from these wearables are correct and have clinical significance. That's the problem right now. And most of this, we're at the stage where most of what we are gathering right now is going to be thrown away because it's not good enough, and there's not enough thinking on how they can be used to advance consumer interests. But I think the next evolution of these instrumentations and wearables will give us something that is useful.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that kind of leads into, because we're talking about passive, the data, how it's collected and everything, but we haven't really gotten to, the regulatory kind of aspects of that. So, I mean, we've so far kind of assumed that, we're just going to get this information from people and everyone's going to readily give it to us, when in reality that's not true. And then there's also government and regulation that we have to be cognizant of. I mean, Jeff from, what's your company again, Jeff? What? Oh, okay. Yeah, that company. I'm sure they're great. So he was mentioning why it's important to be on top of your regulatory knowledge by each different country. So I guess, Todd, from your perspective, when it comes to that regulation, how do we make sure that we're keeping ourselves abiding by the law, and that we're not getting ourselves into any snafus that could potentially get us into trouble from a passive PII standpoint?
Hire an attorney, obviously. And I'm serious about that because I think that a lot of these regulations are very difficult for laymen to understand. In Singapore, we have what's called the Personal Data Privacy Act, PDPA. And as a marketer, I've read through those regulations and attended seminars, and I'm still not entirely clear about what I'm allowed and not allowed to do as a marketer. So yes, I think it is important to get the counsel of an expert to truly understand it. And I think, it's also about just using common sense and erring on the side of not doing something you wouldn't want done to yourself as a consumer. I think that good common sense and treating customers like valued customers, I think should override, should be your overriding judgment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the complexity there, even by one market, is kind of, it's difficult to maintain, especially the regulatory, because they're always catching up to us. They're always behind us. We don't know what we've done wrong yet. And I mean, for the panel industry, we do this across multiple markets all the time. How do we make sure that we're, obviously with the attorney aside, how do we take into different complexities from markets in terms of the regulations there, like Kuala Lumpur versus Thailand versus, Tokyo even?
So for the most part, our panel is in the US, UK, and Australia. So we're able to comply, with the laws of just these places, and then we work with partners, and we rely on what they're collecting. And the truth is that in many cases, we're asking information when we're building our profiles and building our panel, we're asking information that's not that interesting. We're asking people how much money they make within a range. We're asking them where they work, but not specifically where they work. This kind of information is really valuable to market researchers, but it's not so personal. When you start asking people about the products they have and the diseases they have, that gets a little bit more personal, but it's kind of an aggregate base, and we don't really know who they are. To me, what's scarier in the personal data space is the third-party data providers who are collecting all this and then selling it. And I feel like if regulators knew what was happening there, they would ban that. But of course, it's very hard for them to figure out that there's kind of like this brokerage of people's personal data that's going all over the place. And you don't even need it in your own, like you don't need it in Malaysia. You can just buy it from Facebook and you've got it anywhere else in the world. And Facebook doesn't really have to go in each location and decide, whether to comply with the laws or not, because, to them it's not that personal. It's only becomes personal when they broker it. So I think that's where it gets scary when you're like buying this third-party data, and that it's helpful to actually use panels where it's less personal, but at the same time it's more personal because people have shared the information and it's actually accurate because people told you what it is.
Yeah, definitely, that's great. I mean, George, do you have anything that you wanted to add on that topic? Not really? All right. I mean, I said I wasn't going to do this kind of like Q&A thing at the end, but you guys didn't really participate with us or raise your hands. So now I'm going to ask you guys directly. Is there anybody that wants to kind of throw a topic out for us so we can discuss, or something from your own side that you just wanted to make a statement about? Again, my mustached friend.
Now it's a question to the
Please
panel.
continue.
Yeah. Data privacy. How much, how long, what is it that we can do from an industry perspective? Because it's just creeping in. Is there something called privacy anymore?
Want to field that one, Eli or Todd? George?
So the principle behind data protection acts that are commonly passed by governments around the world, it's really to keep the use of the data within the customer relationship. That's basically the principle. So if you're a bank, it's okay to collect information from your banking customers, but you must only use that information within the context of the banking relationship. It becomes illegal, possibly illegal. Nobody has really tested the boundaries of these laws completely yet. When the bank starts partnering with, say, grocers or telcos, or to leverage on that data, then potentially they could be deviating from that client relationship. So I think as long as we're advancing consumer interests within the relationship that is contracted, all right, between the service provider and the customer, there is not much problem with collecting data, no matter how extensive or even private that data is. Yeah. So as Eli mentioned, the advertising industry, it's probably crossing the line right now, especially programmatic advertising, by buying and selling personal data on consumers without explicit consent from the consumers. And because this is this whole industry is cross-national, it's very difficult to pin down who the crooks are and how to write laws to constrain them. But we are very, very sure that consumers are aware that their interests are being compromised and that governments will react to it eventually. So one very lucrative opportunity that has come up, for example, for the telecommunication company, that's a sector that I worked in, is something called ad blocking, network-based ad blocking. It means that consumers will not be receiving advertisements from ad networks unless they have given permission to the telco to release the ads to them. So even though Facebook could be targeting you with ads or whatever, there are technologies that at the network level that can block these ads so that these ads cannot reach you. And so unfortunately, there's now some questions within the industry on whether telcos are doing this out of consumer interest, or are they trying to extort money from the ad networks? All right, so this is still an unanswered question, but there are clearly rising consciousness about this, and there's increasing response both from commercial and government bodies.
Great, thanks for jumping on that, George. Does anybody else have a comment or question, perhaps someone who doesn't have an amazing mustache? No? All right, well, I mean, for me, I guess kind of wrapping this all together, and obviously we touched a bit on mobile data, passive, implicit, and explicit as well. And I mean, we've got Todd who's going to be speaking right after this, where he's going to give us kind of like the do's and don'ts about mobile from his experience. So I guess in terms of the panel, we wanted to wrap it up around here. If there's any closing remarks or any questions that anybody wanted to ask, we could take them now. Or we can move directly into Todd's presentation.
I could just add on, as far as the personal data, I feel like consumers don't yet realize how much data they're sharing with the products they're using. Like if, in the US there was this company called Gas Buddy where you could look up gas prices, and it was, if you searched gas prices in any city, it would tell you the gas prices, and it was the dominant company for a really long time for cheap people. But now there's an alternative, and there are many different companies that give gas prices, and they give it from credit cards. So they're buying it from MasterCard and Visa, and they're actually accurate. It's not user-generated anymore. So if people would go to a pump and think, well, if I use my credit card, I'm now supplying how much I'm driving and how much I'm paying, and possibly even what car you're using and what kind of gas you're putting in your car, versus you just use cash. And maybe you're on a closed caption camera, but nobody's really looking at that unless they rob the gas station. So consumers need to realize that when they buy a Fitbit, it's checking in, it's sharing all that information. When you walk around with your Wi-Fi on, you're sharing what you're doing. When you walk around with your GPS on, Google knows where you are. If you have an Android, Google knows everything about you. So consumers don't yet realize these things. And when consumers become aware, then they tell the regulators, we're freaked out. And actually, it's even more. When the regulators kind of get a little younger, and they start using these things themselves. Like, if you would have government leaders with a Fitbit and then their data got leaked, what their heart rate is, you can guarantee within 24 hours there will be something. So that's not happening yet, but it will. So consumer aware, not leaked yet. Consumer awareness on this personal data I think is important. I think in this room we're probably a little bit more conscious about what we do, but the average consumer doesn't realize that they're living their life kind of like the Truman Show, like 24/7, someone is watching.
Wow, that's very upbeat. That just opened my eyes a little bit. It's kind of scary. How do you recover from that? But it's all very relevant. We got a question. Great. Can
Hi,
you help us bring the mood up?
Initially, I don't have much questions, but because of what he just mentioned, yes, consumer wouldn't know that they are disclosing a lot of information. I agree with that. But what about research company? I don't know who own all those data. How can you ensure that there's no hackers hack into your database for the data? Is that a way that we can ensure that?
I personally, for me, I'm not here to answer any questions, and clearly I don't want to answer that one. Because frankly, I don't think there is a way that we're able to stop that. If somebody puts their mind to it, if they want it, they're going to get it. If they put a lot of effort into it. I don't know how you guys think. I mean, if regulatory commissions are that far behind us, stopping them from getting that information is even further behind them. I mean, what do you guys think? Is there a way to stop the hacking of information like that?
I think that the research information is far more benign than, like, let's say Facebook's information. Like, when Facebook pops up of like, hey, here's all the countries you've been to this year, like, there's a good way to look at that of like, wow, I'm quite the traveler, or wow, that's really creepy. So if you're scared of hacking, like, if the research companies are the least place I'd be concerned. Like, I'd really want to see like other people's Facebook and like, see who they're taking pictures of and what they're deleting and, whose pages they're looking at, who they're stalking. Like, yeah. Forget who they've liked. It's like all of your activity is tracked. Sorry to be the downer here, but like
it's great.
But from like just looking at technology available, Todd's in obviously the retail industry. So in the U.S. you have Amazon with the dash button. Like that's like a little button that people kind of put anywhere. Now they're sharing when they're ready to make a purchase. Like, you could look at that as the convenience, and that's the way consumers look at it. But I'm sure Amazon had a lot more, reasons to make that.
And I mean, what else is Facebook except a way for us to kind of stalk our exes and stuff like that? I mean, if you guys can utilize it, you're giving away your information. So, I mean, again, yeah, the market research is probably the most benign area of that. But yeah, I mean, Jeff, what do you got, man?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I remember reading a book by Bill Gates. This was quite prescient in a way, because he spoke about the future, and then the future was still, I think he was predicting maybe 10, 15 years out. But it seems to be more prescient what he was predicting then, which is all around the value of data, personal data, and that the point will come where consumers get paid for their attention and get paid for their data and for their personal information. So it's an interesting, I'd just like to ask the panel what your views are on that, where we get to, will we ever get to a point with greater awareness amongst consumers that their value of their data is even more valuable than what they're being currently compensated for?
Which in most cases is nothing. Most people aren't getting compensated at all for their information. So I guess we'll keep that as the final question here, because I'm getting the wrap up button here. You guys can't see it, but I can. And then we'll move on to Todd. But yeah, I guess to field that last question, anybody want to take a stab at it? I mean, me and Eli have been talking a lot.
I guess I would only say that if you look at Facebook's revenue per user, active user, it works out to like $4.50 US a year. So, I know a lot of people are concerned about data and exposing data, but when you actually look at the monetary value of it, at least what Facebook, which is a pretty efficient revenue generating machine, has still only been able to generate a couple of dollars a year. So I think the reality is that people's belief of what their data is worth is very different from the economic reality of what their data is worth.
Yeah,
So I totally agree with Todd's comment. In general, the kind of data that you would release as you blow away your day and in social media and all that, it's not super valuable. And I don't think there will come a time where consumers can be paid by Facebook or Google for using Gmail or using Facebook Messenger. Even if it happens, it's very, very little. But there is a special case for this, and that is your genetic sequence, your personal genome. When medicine becomes personalized, then the selling of your genome, the data on your genes could become quite valuable. For example, researchers of HIV researchers have found that there are pockets of individuals within the African continent that are resistant to AIDS. Even they have been repeatedly exposed to the virus, they do not, to the HIV virus, they are not infected. So the question is, what is it about them that makes them resistant to the HIV virus? So imagine this, so we have to get the consent of these people to, to obtain their DNA for pharmaceutical research purposes. Now, imagine that, that this data can be paid. Right now, it's free, right? It's just obtained by consent and no payment was made. But imagine some compensation can be then made to these individuals. Then they can participate in, in advancing the welfare, the well-being of humanity in a for-profit fashion, all right? In a fair and equitable fashion. So pharmaceutical companies that stand to gain billions for these kinds of drugs can then pay out, an upfront payment of these future benefits to individuals who contribute their genome to this research. And I think it's worth paying for, this data.
That's really interesting. So we'll close the panel on that because we're now going to be moving into Todd's discussion. Thank you guys. You've all been wonderful, and thanks for the panelists as well.